Locke on Religious Toleration, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I gave you a general introduction to the two principles of religious freedom as understood at the time of the founding, free exercise and non-establishment. And I talked about, especially about how kind of this was viewed at the time of the founding, the First Amendment and things like that, and began to give you an introduction to Locke's letter concerning toleration, which is really a defense of free exercise, not of non-establishment. And I talked about the particular problem which he's addressing, namely the belief that the government should actively promote the true religion and suppress false religions. That belief was one of the things that fueled the destructive conflicts of the Reformation. And Locke thinks that it is misguided. Locke thinks that it's all based on a false premise, namely the premise that the government is actually able to save your soul. And he doesn't believe that's true. So now we get to the letter concerning toleration proper, and I wanted to make one terminological note. In this work, he wrote it in Latin. This English version is a very old English version in your packet. This begins on page 99, but Locke himself is not responsible for the English. He wrote it in Latin. But in this English translation of the Latin, Locke talks about the Commonwealth, and by Commonwealth here he means what he meant in the second treatise, namely a political community. So the Commonwealth refers to a particular, what we would say is a country or a political community. But when he talks about the magistrate, what he means by magistrate is what we would say is the government or the state. So the people who are actually in charge and doing things. So when he says the magistrate should not suppress religion, what he means is the government shouldn't. The government of the Commonwealth should not suppress religion. So the Commonwealth and the magistrate. And Locke's basic argument is he says that the Commonwealth commonwealths exist to protect civil interests, which, as he defines it, is basically what we saw in the second treatise: the life, liberty, property, prosperity of the citizenry. That's what government exists to do: is to protect you from harm, to protect your life, liberty, and property. And the way that the government does that is through making laws. So it makes rules for protecting those things. And then it uses coercion to enforce those rules, right? The threat and infliction of punishment. And of course, also the use of force to protect the community. But this is all rational and just, according to Locke. Our life, liberty, and property are insecure without government. You create a government to protect them. The way that government protects life, liberty, and property is by making rules to protect them and then using force to enforce those rules. So it is just for the government to use coercion in the name of protecting the civil interests of society. What the government does not have a duty or right to do, though, according to Locke, is to try to force you to adopt a particular religion in the name of saving your soul. And remember, this is, at first, a lot of the time, he's addressing a specifically Christian audience. And so within the Christian context, the idea, the reason why you would want the government to force people to adopt the true religion and punish people or try to prevent people from adopting a false religion, you would do that. You wouldn't say, oh, it's because I just like persecuting people. You'd say, no, I'm doing this because I want people to go to heaven. And if they don't belong to the true religion, they're not going to go to heaven. So I want people to save their souls. And in the name of their salvation, I'm going to force them, whether they like it or not, to adopt the true religion. And I'm not going to let people go to hell by adopting false religions. I'm going to try to prevent that, right? So the ostensibly philanthropic motivation for forcing people to adopt a particular religion and preventing them from adopting other ones is in the name of their salvation. And Locke argues that actually just doesn't work. The government is incapable of saving your soul and therefore does not have the right to try to by compelling you to worship a certain way. And he says that on page 100, where he says in the middle paragraph, which begins, "It is the duty of the civil magistrate by impartial execution of equal laws to secure unto all the people in general and to every one of his subjects in particular the just possession of these things belonging to this life." And he goes on to say, and people who break those rules should be punished. Next paragraph, he says, now that the whole jurisdiction of the magistrate reaches only to these civil concernments, and that all civil power, right, and dominion is bounded and confined to the only care of promoting these things, namely worldly things, and that it neither can nor ought in any manner to be extended to the salvation of souls, these following considerations seem unto me abundantly to demonstrate. So this is what he goes on to argue. The government cannot and therefore should not try to save your soul. And he argues in the first place that there is no evidence that God has directly given any government the power to force people to adopt a particular religion, right? And here he's in appealing to a Protestant audience. He's appealing to the biblical teachings. And he would say there's nowhere in the New Testament where you see God giving any particular government the right to suppress non-Christian religions and force people to be Christian. He also argues, and this goes from page 100 to 101, he says that subjects could not give kings or magistrates this right either. Because you can imagine the logic would be this way. You could say, okay, God does not directly give the government the power to enforce religion. And somebody might say, well, that's fine, but what if, by the consent of the governed, the people give the government the power, like in the Constitution, give the government the power to determine their religion? And Locke says you can't do that either. That actually doesn't work. He says, nor can any such, I'll just read this paragraph. It says, first, because the care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than to other men. It is not committed unto him, I say, by God, right? God doesn't, but because it appears not that God has ever given any such authority to one man over another, as to compel anyone to his religion. Right? So in other words, you can't find any proof in the Bible of God giving some people the right to force other people to adopt a particular religion. And he says, nor can any such power be vested in the magistrate by the consent of the people, because no man can so far abandon the care of his own salvation as blindly to leave it to the choice of any other, whether prince or subject, to prescribe to him what faith or worship he shall embrace. For no man can, if he would, conform his faith to the dictates of another. Now he's going to go on to give a reason why, which is really the one of the core arguments that he uses multiple times in the letter concerning toleration. So here what he's making the claim is nobody can actually give somebody else the power to determine what they believe. Like I can't give you the power to determine what I think is true. And this is what he goes on to say. All the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind. And faith is not faith without believing. That is, to have faith in a religious creed means genuinely to believe it's true. Not just saying you think it's true, but genuinely believing it's true. That's faith. Conviction. Not just words, but conviction. He says, whatever profession we make, to whatever outward worship we conform, if we are not fully satisfied in our own mind that the one is true, namely the profession, and the other well-pleasing unto God, namely the worship, such profession and such practice, far from being any furtherance, are indeed great obstacles to our salvation. For in this manner, instead of expiating other sins by the exercise of religion, I say, and offering thus unto God Almighty such a worship as we esteem to be displeasing unto him, we add unto the number of our other sins, those also of hypocrisy and contempt of his divine majesty. So in other words, it is not, he would say, it is not pleasing to God, and it's not genuine faith simply to pay lip service to a particular religious belief system and go through the motions of worship if you don't really believe that they're true. Instead, what you're being is a hypocrite. You're pretending to believe things that you don't really believe. And you're pretending to be performing acts that you claim will be pleasing to God, when in fact you don't believe that. So simply saying things and doing things is not the same thing as faith. And his point here is that when some people try to force other people to adopt a religion, what they're actually doing is they're making people hypocrites. If I say to somebody, you have to be a Catholic and you have to attend Mass, or else I will punish you. That might be enough. The fear of punishment might be enough to get that person to claim to be a Catholic and to attend Mass and to go through the motions. But if that person doesn't really believe that Catholicism is true and that these are the ways that God wants you to worship, then that's not going to save your soul. If anything, it's sinful to pretend. It's an offense against God to pretend to believe things you don't believe. That's his argument. As he goes on to say, in the second place, the care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate because his power consists only in outward force. But true and saving religion consists in the inward persuasion of the mind, without which nothing can be acceptable to God. And such is the nature of the understanding that it cannot be compelled to the belief of anything by outward force. Confiscation of estate, imprisonment, torments, nothing of that nature can have any such efficacy as to make men change the inward judgment they have framed of things. End of quotation. And that's the core argument, right? Because if you bring government into it, you say, I'm going to help people save their souls by forcing them to adopt the true religion and preventing them from adopting false religions. Locke's argument is what you're going to do with those people is you're actually going to make hypocrites. For fear of punishment, that's the outward force he was talking about. Fear of punishment might make people conform to those commands and, recite the creed and engage in the worship. But if they don't really believe it, it's not going to save them. Right? And here he's especially appealing to the Christian notion that salvation requires faith, where faith is true belief. So Locke's main point is the use or the threat of force, which is how the magistrate acts, can't save your soul. Remember, how does a magistrate act? By making rules and threatening to punish those who break the rules. Right? That's how we protect life, liberty, and property. We make laws against murder. We make laws against kidnapping. We make laws against theft and fraud, etc. And then we punish people who break those rules. So when it comes to the enforcement of religion, right, what this would entail is that the magistrate would make laws commanding people to worship in certain ways and forbidding them from worshiping in other ways, and then would threaten to punish people who break those rules. And so this is why this is relying on outward force. You're appealing to people's fear of punishment. Say the right things, worship the right way, or I will punish you. And Locke's argument is that's not going to generate faith. That's not how it works, right? I could say to you, I could hold a gun to your head, and I could say, believe that 2 + 2 = 5, or I will kill you. And probably most people in a situation like that, if they found themselves with a gun to their head and being commanded to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, will say, okay, yes, I believe that 2 + 2 = 5, right? Because they don't want to die. So they'll say what they're supposed to say. But I think we all know that that wouldn't change what they actually believe. It wouldn't change, as Locke puts it, the inward judgment that they have framed of things. You would still actually believe that 2 + 2 = 4. You would just say that you believe that 2 + 2 = 5 in order to avoid punishment. And basically that's what the compelling religious belief and worship does, because that's no different from, holding a gun up to somebody's head and saying, believe that the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church, or I will kill you. And people might say, fine, I believe that the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church, because they don't want to be killed or punished. But that's not going to change what they genuinely believe. That's not going to give them faith. And if they don't have faith, they're not saved. Right? The only way to be saved is to genuinely believe. And government action can't do that. The mind just doesn't work that way. Right? And what's interesting about this is that the whole premise of Locke's argument is, in fact, that in a sense, the will has no control over what we believe to be true. We cannot will ourselves to believe something to be true that we don't believe is true. Either your mind is persuaded or you're not, and you have no control over that. You cannot, through an act of will, make yourself believe that 2 + 2 = 5, because you just know that it equals 4. Right? So there are the things that you think are true, and there's everything else. And the only way to change that is, directly, the only way to change that is through reasoning, right? Where you realize, oh, I thought this was true, but it was wrong. Or this one thing that I thought was false, well, it turns out it was true. But you need reasons. Usually it's reasons or some kind of, psychological process where you come to believe something. And threats and administering punishments, those aren't reasons to believe anything. Technically it's a logical fallacy. If I say, believe this or I'll hurt you, that's actually called the argumentum ad baculum, appeal to the stick. And it's considered to be a fallacy because, of course, the threat of punishment is not in itself a reason to believe something. That's not providing you grounds for adopting a belief. And so Locke is applying this to religion, that the fact that you'll be punished if you don't go along with something does not give you a reason to believe it's true. It might give you a reason to act like you think it's true, but that's not faith. Right? So the basic kind of syllogism you could say that Locke sets up here is salvation requires faith. Faith means sincere belief, genuinely believing something to be true. So salvation requires sincere religious belief. But coercion, laws and threats of punishment, coercions cannot produce sincere belief. Therefore, coercion cannot produce faith. Therefore, coercion cannot save your soul. Faith is sincere belief. So salvation requires faith. Faith is sincere belief. Coercion cannot produce sincere belief. Therefore, coercion cannot produce faith or salvation. And it follows from this that the government does not have the right to coerce you in the name of saving your soul. The government doesn't have the right to try to do something that's impossible. So if it turns out that laws and threats of punishment can't bring about salvation, then the government, sort of by force of reason, does not have the right to use coercion in the name of saving people's souls. Now he goes on to say, on page 101, he goes on to say, look, the government, people in the government, the king or whoever it might be, they're people. They're going to have their religious beliefs, and they have the right to try to persuade people to adopt their beliefs. And in fact, within the letter concerning toleration, you can see that Locke believes in something like what we might call a right to evangelize. That he believes that people, not only do people have the right to profess, but they have the right to profess their religious beliefs to other people. So people in government, just like anybody else, they have a right to profess their religious beliefs and to try to persuade people to adopt them. You just don't have the right to try to compel people by saying, adopt this religious system or else you will be punished. That's what you don't have the right to do. So that's Locke's discussion of the role of the state or the government with religion. So basically, the government should tolerate people in their professions of religious faith and worship, and should not try to enforce any particular religion or suppress any particular religion, because the use of coercion cannot save people's souls. So you can't promote a religion in the name of salvation. You also can't suppress religion in the name of trying to save people from hell, because coercion does not produce faith. So therefore, the government should have a hands-off approach to religion, tolerating people in their various beliefs and practices. There are limits to that toleration, but that's the basic argument. So in the next lecture, I will go on to talk about Locke's discussion of churches, and then his kind of more specific rules about what should and should not be tolerated.